All right, buckle up, everybody, because we're going deep on this one. We're talking cybersecurity, but not the usual stuff. We're diving headfirst into this book, Battlefield Cyber. And it argues that we're missing a huge EG piece of the puzzle when it comes to cyber threats, like way bigger than just data breaches and hackers.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Battlefield Cyber basically says we've been looking at this all wrong. It's not just about hackers trying to steal your credit card or disrupt some website. The real threat, the one that keeps the authors up at night, is coming from China and Russia.
Okay, China and Russia, those are familiar names in the news. But what are they doing in the cyber realm that's so different? We hear about election interference, espionage, all that.
Right, but this book goes deeper. They say it's not just about meddling, it's about fundamentally undermining democracies, and they're using sober tactics to do it.
Okay, I'm all ears. This is getting interesting. So what's their playbook? What exactly are they up to?
Well, the book makes this really compelling case that the traditional view of cyber warfare is too narrow. You know, we think of hacking, denial of service attacks, that kind of thing. But Battlefield Cyber says that's only part of the story. They claim that data theft is the real weapon here, and China is the master of this game.
Data theft. That's not new, right? Companies get hacked, data gets stolen. It's almost routine these days.
True, but we're not just talking about credit card numbers or passwords here. This book says China, specifically their Ministry of State Security, or MSS, they're building these incredibly detailed profiles on influential Americans.
Influential Americans, like who?
Politicians, business leaders, scientists, anyone they might want to influence down the line. And they're not just gathering basic info, they're going deep.
Deep, like how?
Think health records, financial data, travel itineraries, social media posts, the whole 9 yards. They're trying to build a complete picture of these individuals.
So instead of just stealing data to make a quick buck, they're trying to understand how these people think.
Precisely. They want to know what motivates them, their strengths, their weaknesses, all to figure out how to exploit them later.
That is some next level stuff. So
Yeah.
they're basically weaponizing information.
Exactly. It's like they're building a giant psychological profile of America's power players and then using that information to gain leverage.
That's a chilling thought. It almost sounds like something out of a spy movie.
Well, the book even gives this crazy example of how the MSS used a list of known software vulnerabilities, a list that was actually published by the U.S. government to their advantage.
Wow, so they're using our own transparency against us.
It's a classic case of turning our strengths into weaknesses.
So China's playing the long game, gathering intel, building profiles, waiting for the right moment to strike. What about Russia? Are they doing something similar?
Russia definitely has a different approach. They're less about the subtle, long-term manipulation and more about causing immediate chaos. Think about their interference in the 2016 election.
Oh yeah, that was a wild time. All that talk about fake news and social media bots.
Right, well, that was Russia's military intelligence agency, the GRU, at work. They hacked the Democratic National Committee, released all those stolen emails through WikiLeaks, and bam, instant chaos.
And potentially swayed the election, depending on who you ask. So very different tactics from China, but still aimed at disrupting democracy.
According to Battlefield Cyber, that's the common thread. Both China and Russia are exploiting the open nature of our societies, our reliance on technology, and our free flow of information. Basically, they're turning our strengths into vulnerabilities.
Okay, so we've got China playing the long game, Russia going for the quick hit, both aiming to weaken democracies from the inside. Now let's talk about something a bit more, well, relatable to our everyday lives. Ransomware, you know those attacks where hackers hold your computer hostage and demand money to unlock it?
Ransomware, a classic. Believe it or not, this has been around for longer than you think.
Really? I thought this was a relatively new phenomenon.
Nope. One of the first recorded cases goes all the way back to 1989. A Harvard primatologist, someone who studies monkeys, created a program that locked up computers. And he demanded payment on a floppy disk to unlock them.
Wait, a primatologist, so not your typical hacker stereotype, huh?
Definitely not the image that comes to mind when you think cyber criminal. But hey, it shows that this idea of holding data hostage has been around for a while, and today it's evolved into this massive criminal enterprise.
Massive how?
We're talking ransomware as a service, or RAIS. Basically, cyber criminals can buy and sell ransomware tools on the dark web. It's like a one-stop shop for aspiring cyber criminals.
So you're telling me there are entire businesses built around helping criminals launch ransomware attacks?
That's exactly what's happening. Battlefield Cyber actually uses this analogy of the dark web being like a hidden city. You need to know specific addresses, these onion addresses, to find anything. And these RAIS operations, they're like the digital mob bosses.
Okay, I'm getting the picture. So instead of a shady back alley deal, We've got this sophisticated online marketplace for cybercrime tools.
Exactly, and it's incredibly dangerous because it lowers the barrier to entry. You don't need to be a coding genius anymore to launch a ransomware attack.
And it's not just individuals being targeted, right? We've seen hospitals, schools, even government agencies crippled by ransomware attacks.
You're absolutely right, and that's a key point that Battlefield Cyber stresses. Ransomware isn't just about stealing money anymore. It's about disrupting critical infrastructure, potentially causing chaos, and even putting lives at risk.
Yeah, I remember that 60 Minutes interview with that cybersecurity expert. He was talking about how gas pumps, food supply chains, even ATMs could be vulnerable to these attacks.
That's the scary reality we're facing. And what's even more concerning is the potential for unintended consequences. The book raises the question of whether the sanctions imposed on Russia, after the invasion of Ukraine, could actually be backfiring and pushing more people into cybercrime.
Backfiring, how so?
Well, their argument is that by limiting Russia's access to the global economy, we might be driving more skilled tech workers towards cybercrime out of desperation.
So they're saying that by trying to punish Russia, we might inadvertently be creating more cybercriminals.
It's a complex issue and one that Battlefield Cyber really digs into.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about China's approach to this whole cyber warfare thing.
Yeah.
The book tells this chilling story about Nortel, the Canadian telecom giant. Being hacked by China for years, they were stealing intellectual property, basically using Nortel's research to build up their own tech industry.
Oh, yeah. The Nortel story is a classic case of corporate espionage, and it really highlights the human cost of this cyber warfare.
Human costs.
The book introduces us to this guy, Brian Shields, a security expert at Nortel. He discovered the breach, that the Chinese were inside their network, but no one believed him.
So this guy was like a cybersecurity Cassandra, warning everyone about the impending doom, but no one listened.
Exactly. He was labeled an alarmist even though he had evidence. And ultimately, Nortel went bankrupt. Many believe the Chinese hacking played a big role in their downfall.
Wow, that's tragic. So this wasn't just about stealing data. It was about crippling a competitor.
That's the point Battlefield Cyber makes. It's economic warfare, plain and simple. China is using cyber tactics to steal intellectual property to gain an economic advantage.
It's like playing a game with a cheat code, right? Stealing the answers from your opponent so you can win.
That's a good analogy. And it's not just Nortel. This is a pattern with China.
So what can we do about it? How do we protect ourselves from this kind of economic warfare?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that Battlefield Cyber tries to answer. We'll dive into some potential solutions in our next segment.
Okay, sounds like we've got a lot more ground to cover. It's wild to think that a company like Nortel, a giant in its field, could be brought down by something as intangible as cyber attacks. It makes you realize how much power there is in information. And speaking of power, Battlefield Cyber dives into this idea of China controlling the future of data, something they call the digital Silk Road.
Yeah, the digital Silk Road, it's a powerful concept. Think about it. China used to dominate the silk trade, right? Controlling the flow of goods and wealth across continents. Now they're trying to do the same thing with data.
So they're aiming for digital dominance, making themselves the gatekeepers of information in the 21st century.
That's the idea. They want to control the infrastructure, the technology, the standards, everything. And they're using companies like Huawei to achieve that.
Huawei, yeah. They're everywhere these days, building 5G networks, laying undersea cables. They're a major player in the global tech scene.
Exactly, and that's what makes them so strategic for China. They're the tip of the spear, so to speak, in this push for digital dominance. And there are serious concerns about whether their equipment could be used for espionage or sabotage.
I've heard those concerns before, but is there any proof? Or is it just speculation?
Well, Battlefield Cyber drops a bombshell. They claim that IBM, the granddaddy of tech companies, was compromised by a Chinese hacking group. APT-10, they're known for their sophisticated cyber espionage operations.
Hold on, IBM, the company that practically invented cybersecurity, was hacked.
According to the book, yeah. And get this, they didn't even realize it at first.
Seriously, that's kind of hard to believe.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It just shows you how good these Chinese hackers are. They were able to infiltrate IBM's systems, steal data, and leave no trace.
That is a scary thought. If IBM can be hacked without even knowing it, who's safe?
It's a wake-up call for sure. It shows that we're dealing with some incredibly skilled adversaries.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's been in the news a lot lately. Social media. I feel like every time I log on, I'm bombarded with misinformation, propaganda. It's overwhelming.
Social media has become a major battleground in this cyber warfare, no doubt.
Battlefield Cyber actually argues that it's making our society more vulnerable to these attacks. How so?
Think about it. Social media is designed to keep you engaged, right? To keep you scrolling, clicking, sharing. And that often means appealing to your emotions rather than your rational mind.
So you're saying it's exploiting our natural tendency to react emotionally?
Exactly. And that creates a perfect breeding ground for disinformation and propaganda.
Because when we're emotional, we're less likely to think critically about what we're seeing.
Exactly. We're more likely to share things without checking if they're true.
And that's how misinformation spreads like wildfire.
Right. And then you have the algorithms, which further personalize your feed. So you end up in these echo chambers where you're only seeing information that confirms your existing biases.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. It's like everyone's living in their own little reality bubble.
And that makes it really difficult to have a productive conversation about anything.
Because everyone's coming at it from such a different perspectives. Do you remember that interview we did with Clint Watts, the expert on disinformation?
Yeah, he was fascinating.
He was talking about how Russia has been using these active measures to influence public opinion since the Cold War.
He made the point that social media has just given them a much more powerful tool to do that.
Because now they can reach a global audience 24/7. And it's not just Russia. China's also getting in on the act.
Absolutely. Battlefield Cyber highlights how China is using social media to shape narratives and push its own agenda. They give the example of China amplifying Putin's propaganda about the war in Ukraine, essentially echoing his talking points to a massive audience.
So it's a coordinated effort. They're working together to control the narrative.
It seems that way. And it's not just about amplifying existing narratives, they're also creating their own. The book talks about how China is flooding social media with fake accounts, using sophisticated techniques like black hat SEO to manipulate search engine results.
So even when you're trying to be objective and search for information, you might still be exposed to their propaganda.
That's the danger.
It feels like we're fighting a losing battle, like we're drowning in a sea of information and can't tell what's real anymore.
It's definitely a challenge, and one that's only going to get harder as technology advances.
Okay, let's move on to another key theme in Battlefield Cyber: software vulnerabilities. It seems like every other day there's news about some major software flaw that's putting millions of people at risk.
Software is the foundation of our digital world, but it's also incredibly complex. Think of it like a giant puzzle with millions of pieces, and if even one piece is out of place, the whole thing can fall apart.
So every line of code is a potential point of weakness.
In a way, yeah. And the problem is that companies often prioritize speed and features over security.
They want to get their products to market quickly, which means they sometimes cut corners.
That's often the case. And then you have the issue of known vulnerabilities.
Known vulnerabilities, you mean flaws in software that hackers already know about.
Exactly. These are vulnerabilities that have been publicly disclosed, often with detailed instructions on how to exploit them.
So it's like leaving a blueprint for burglars, showing them exactly how to break into your house.
It's not that far off, and sometimes companies know about these vulnerabilities but don't patch them quickly enough.
Why not?
There are a few reasons. Sometimes they're worried about disrupting their users, forcing them to update their software. Other times it's a matter of resources. They simply don't have the manpower to fix every vulnerability right away.
But that leaves everyone vulnerable, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay, so what about the cloud? Isn't that supposed to be more secure? We're told all the time to store our data in the cloud.
The cloud has its advantages, for sure. But Battlefield Cyber argues that it's also a major security risk. Think about it. You're essentially handing over your data to a third-party provider and trusting them to keep it safe.
It's like putting all your valuables in a safe deposit box, but you don't actually control the bank.
That's a good analogy. And the book highlights the lack of accountability in the cloud. If there's a breach, it can be incredibly difficult to determine who is responsible.
And to get your data back, right?
Exactly.
Now, what's the solution? Should we just avoid the cloud altogether?
That's not realistic. The cloud is here to stay. But we need to be smarter about how we use it. Choose reputable providers, implement strong security measures, and understand how your data is being handled.
So it's about being informed and taking precautions, like with anything else online. Okay, Battlefield Cyber also dives into another area that's particularly vulnerable: the defense supply chain. Now, I'm not a military expert, but I'm guessing this refers to all the companies that manufacture weapons and equipment for the military.
You got it. We're talking about a vast network of contractors, big and small, providing everything from fighter jets and missiles to software and communications systems.
So a lot of moving parts, a lot of potential points of weakness.
Exactly, and that's what makes the defense supply chain such an attractive target for cyber adversaries, especially for China.
Why China?
The book argues that China is engaged in a massive campaign of industrial espionage. They're using cyber tactics to steal military technology, blueprints, software code, anything they can get their hands on.
And then using that stolen technology to build up their own military capabilities.
Precisely. They're essentially leapfrogging ahead technologically by stealing our secrets.
It's like playing catch-up. But instead of working hard, you just steal the answers from the smartest kid in class.
It's a good way to put it.
The book actually quotes FBI Director Christopher Wray on this. He calls it the greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality.
That's a pretty dire assessment, and it highlights the seriousness of this issue.
So what can we do to protect the defense supply chain?
That's a tough one. Because we're not just talking about defending against traditional hackers. We're talking about sophisticated state-sponsored attacks. These are highly skilled adversaries with vast resources.
So it's like playing chess against a grandmaster, but they can cheat by looking at your moves ahead of time.
It's an uphill battle, that's for sure. And what makes it even harder is that many of these smaller contractors in the defense supply chain, they simply can't afford to implement the same level of cybersecurity as the big players.
They're the weak link, the easy targets.
Unfortunately, that's often the case.
It seems like we're facing this multi-pronged attack, with China stealing intellectual property, Russia sowing chaos and disruption, and then you have the internal challenges, the software vulnerabilities, the lack of cybersecurity awareness. It's a lot to deal with.
It's a complex landscape, that's for sure.
And given how interconnected our economies are, especially with China, it feels like untangling this mess is next to impossible.
Sure. Battlefield Cyber doesn't sugarcoat the challenges, but they do offer some potential solutions, some ways to push back against these threats.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are their suggestions?
Well, they argue that instead of trying to completely decouple from China, which might be impossible at this point, we need to focus on rebalancing the relationship.
Rebalancing, what does that mean?
It means diversifying our supply chains, investing in domestic manufacturing, basically reducing our dependence on China and making ourselves more resilient.
So, not cutting ties completely, but making sure we have other options, right?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we do that in practice? Especially when it comes to technology, where China seems to have a leg up in so many areas.
The book highlights the semiconductor industry as a key battleground. Those tiny chips that power everything from our smartphones to our cars, they're essential to the modern economy.
Right, but we've become so reliant on foreign manufacturers for those chips, haven't we?
We have, and that's a problem, especially when it comes to the most advanced chips, the ones that are used in military applications and cutting-edge technology.
I remember reading about that Dutch company, ASML. They're the only ones who make the machines that can produce those high-end chips.
ASML is a perfect example of how strategically important this industry is. And Battlefield Cyber argues that the U.S. needs to be more proactive in securing its supply of semiconductors.
So investing in domestic manufacturing, working with allies to create alternative supply chains, basically making sure we're not dependent on China for this crucial technology.
That's the idea. It's about diversifying, building redundancy, and not putting all our eggs in one basket.
Okay, so rebalancing the relationship with China, securing our supply of semiconductors, those are some pretty big tasks. What else does Battlefield Cyber recommend?
Well, they also delve into the issue of social disorder.
Social disorder, what do they mean by that?
They argue that social media has become a major amplifier of social disorder. Well, think about it. Social media encourages outrage. It thrives on conflict. It's designed to keep you engaged, even if that means showing you content that is divisive, inflammatory, or just plain false.
So they're saying that social media is actually contributing to the breakdown of social trust and cohesion.
That's their argument. And they're not just blaming foreign adversaries for this. They also point the finger at big tech, the companies that own these platforms.
So it's not just a matter of external threats. It's also about the way these platforms are designed and operated.
Exactly. They argue that big tech's relentless pursuit of profit and growth has come at the expense of social responsibility.
So they're saying that these companies become too powerful, too influential, and they need to be held accountable.
That's the gist of it. They draw parallels between today's tech giants and the robber barons of the 19th century. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, those guys who amassed huge fortunes by controlling key industries.
And just like those robber barons faced antitrust action back then,
Battlefield Cyber suggests that maybe it's time to consider similar measures against big tech.
So are they talking about breaking up these companies?
They don't explicitly call for that, but they do highlight the FTC's efforts to break up Facebook and the stalled legislation that would prevent tech giants from favoring their own products over those of their competitors.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? We want to encourage innovation, but we also need to protect our democracy and our social fabric.
It's a tough one, no doubt.
Okay, we've talked about the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the challenges, but Battlefield Cyber also offers some solutions, some potential paths forward, right?
They do, and one of the most interesting arguments they make is that we need to rethink our relationship with the internet itself.
Rethink our relationship with the internet. What does that mean?
Well, the traditional approach to cybersecurity has been about building walls, keeping the bad guys out. But Battlefield Cyber argues that this approach is no longer sufficient. In fact, they say we need to do the opposite.
The opposite. So instead of building walls, we should be tearing them down.
In a way, yeah, they argue that we need to expand the internet, make it more open, more accessible, more resilient.
But wouldn't that make us more vulnerable to attacks?
They acknowledge the risks, but they say the benefits outweigh them. They argue that retreating from the internet would be a mistake. It would cede control to authoritarian regimes like China, who are already building their own closed-off digital ecosystems.
So instead of hiding from the storm, we need to build a stronger, more weatherproof house.
Exactly. They talk about using technology to counter the forces that are trying to control and manipulate the internet. For example, using low-orbit satellite technology to bypass China's Great Firewall, giving people in oppressed countries access to an uncensored internet.
That's an interesting idea. But how do we address the security risks? If we're expanding the internet, aren't we just creating more opportunities for attacks?
They advocate for new security paradigms that go beyond the traditional approach of just building walls and firewalls. They talk about things like isolation, microsegmentation, obfuscation, techniques that make it harder for attackers to move laterally within a network.
So instead of just trying to keep the bad guys out, we need to find ways to contain them if they do get in.
Right. They also talk about using honeypots, which are basically decoys designed to lure attackers away from sensitive data.
Honeypots, like those things beekeepers use.
Kind of, but in the cybersecurity world, a honeypot is like a fake treasure chest. It's designed to attract hackers, to make them think they've found something valuable.
And then when they try to open it, bam, they've been caught.
Exactly. It's a way to detect and track attackers.
That's pretty clever. So new security paradigms, expanding the internet, what else?
They also emphasize the need for greater personal accountability for security, especially for corporate leadership.
Because ultimately, it's the people in charge who make the decisions about cybersecurity.
Right. They're the ones who set the tone, the culture. They need to prioritize security, invest in training, and make sure their employees are aware of the risks.
Okay, so individual responsibility is important, but what about the bigger picture? What can we do as a society to address these challenges?
Well, Battlefield Cyber advocates for a whole-of-nation approach to cybersecurity.
A whole-of-nation approach. What does that mean?
It means recognizing that cybersecurity is not just a government issue or a tech industry issue. It's a societal issue that affects all of us, and it requires a collective effort to address it.
So everyone needs to be involved, not just the experts.
Exactly. They draw a parallel to World War II, how private industry mobilized alongside the government to win the war.
It was a national effort. Everyone contributed.
Right, and they say we need that same spirit of collaboration and shared responsibility when it comes to cybersecurity.
So more public-private partnerships, better information sharing, a more coordinated response to threats.
That's the idea. They highlight Taiwan as a good example of a country that's doing this well.
Taiwan, really? What are they doing differently?
They have an organization called TWCERT that fosters trust and collaboration between the government and the private sector. They work together to share information about threats, to coordinate responses, and to improve overall cybersecurity.
It's like a cybersecurity SWAT team. But instead of carrying guns, they're carrying laptops and firewalls.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so Battlefield Cyber paints a pretty sobering picture of the challenges we face in this digital age. But they also offer some glimmer of hope, some potential solutions.
They do. They argue that if we're willing to adapt, to innovate, to work together, we can build a more secure and resilient digital future.
Okay, so we've talked about rebalancing our relationship with China, securing our supply chains, and even rethinking our approach to the internet itself. But Battlefield Cyber doesn't stop there. They also take us on a trip into the future, into the metaverse.
Ah, the metaverse, the next frontier.
Yeah, it's all over the news these days. Everyone's talking about virtual worlds, avatars, and all that.
Yeah.
But from a cybersecurity perspective, what are we looking at here?
Well, Battlefield Cyber argues that the metaverse could be a game changer, both in terms of opportunities and risks.
Risks? Like what?
Well, think about it. The metaverse is all about blurring the lines between the physical and digital worlds. It's about creating immersive experiences that feel real. And that creates a whole new set of challenges when it comes to security.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, imagine a scenario where someone's avatar is attacked in the metaverse. Not physically attacked, of course, but harassed, bullied, maybe even psychologically tortured.
I can see how that could be really traumatic, especially if the experience feels real.
Exactly. And then you have the issue of disinformation and propaganda. It's already a huge problem on social media. But in the metaverse, it could be even more immersive, more convincing.
Because you're not just reading text on a screen, you're actually experiencing it.
Exactly. And then you have the potential for cyber attacks that could have real-world consequences.
Like what?
Well, imagine someone hacking into a virtual control system for a power plant or a transportation system.
That's a terrifying thought.
And it's not far-fetched. As the metaverse becomes more integrated with our critical infrastructure, those kinds of attacks could become a reality.
So it's not just about protecting our data anymore, it's about protecting our physical safety as well.
That's the challenge we're facing.
So what can we do about it? How do we prepare for this metaverse future?
Well, Battlefield Cyber emphasizes the importance of education.
Education, like teaching people about cybersecurity.
Not just that, they talk about teaching critical thinking skills, digital citizenship, media literacy, basically giving people the tools they need to navigate this complex and potentially dangerous digital landscape.
So it's about empowering people to be more discerning, more critical of the information they consume.
Exactly, because in the metaverse, it's going to be even harder to tell what's real and what's not.
And what about the role of government? Do they have a part to play in this?
Absolutely. The book calls for clear policies on artificial intelligence, which will play a huge role in the metaverse. They also talk about the need for regulations that address the unique challenges of this new digital frontier.
It's like the Wild West of technology. And we need to establish some rules of the road before things get out of hand.
That's a good analogy.
So it's a lot to think about, a lot to prepare for. But at the same time, it's exciting, isn't it? This whole metaverse thing. It has the potential to be truly transformative.
It does, but it's up to us to make sure that transformation is positive.
That it benefits humanity, not just a select few.
Exactly.
Well, Battlefield Cyber has certainly given us a lot to chew on.
It has.
It's a wake-up call, a challenge, and a call to action. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. It's not just a technical issue, it's a societal issue. And we all need to be aware of the risks, take steps to protect ourselves, and demand better security from the companies and institutions we interact with.
Because ultimately, our future depends on it.
It does.
Well said. On that note, we'll leave you with this thought. The metaverse may be the next frontier, but the battle for cybersecurity is being fought right now, in the real world and in the digital world. And it's a battle we can't afford to lose. So stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay engaged.